Hello, everybody. For quick introduction, I am Ghost Kumo,
I'm Oro.
I'm Gedrith.
and this is a panel on routing, as we like to call it, the building blocks of speedrunning. So, a lot of times I see people asking comments relating to marathons, like, how do people come up with this stuff? How do people find this stuff? And how do people ultimately get to getting a game in a state where it is as completed as fast as it can be? And routing is a big part of that. So for a little bit of background, I personally have routed a lot of indie RPGs, games that kind of come up that not a lot of people have touched. Some of them new, some of them old, but ultimately a lot of games that, nobody had really dabbled into. And so routing ends up being a fairly difficult process when you're dealing with a game that nobody has really touched. What about you guys? Go ahead and give your background on routing.
As far as the more popular stuff is concerned, I've done some stuff with Pokemon. I was very heavily involved with Let's Go when it came out, among others. I was very heavily involved with Hollow Knight when that game came out, and I did a fair amount of work for Code Vein, which came out very, very recently. So.
Yeah, mostly JRPGs for me. The big one being Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Torna, its expansion.
So yeah, as a bit of a note, our experience in certain genres is a little bit more minimal. Would have liked to get someone for like horror or like certain 2D kinds of games, but so not everything we say will apply to every single game, but it's just generally like rules of thumb and trends. So what is routing? As I mentioned, it's sort of piecing together the route. I literally just pulled this image off of Steam. There's a Hollow Knight forum, so Oro, if you want to explain why this route is wrong.
I'm actually not sure exactly which category this is for, but this is actually more or less how I approached Hollow Knight routing. There were very good resources out there already on Steam forums, actually, which is kind of a good thing to bring up that we'll get into a little bit more lately. Check forums for information. But yeah, there was a lot of just taking maps of the whole world of the game and just kind of drawing lines through it in the order that you kind of need to go through to progress in the game. And, with those lines, you can kind of start wrapping them around as, things change and have a really good visual for how the route's going to play out.
Yeah, this is just kind of a visual for like exploration of a 2D game in particular. RPGs, 3D adventure games will tend to be very different. One thing I will mention a little bit later, but would like to stress here, is that every game is very different in how the approach to routing it is concerned. Every game, every style of game will tend to have, different little things that you're going to do when routing it. Like a 2D platformer ends up being fairly difficult to actually test because you have to find out which path is the fastest, and it ends up being a very meticulous dance of trial and error. So some real quick things. Where do you get started on routing a video game? The first thing I would absolutely recommend, first and foremost, is you do your research on any bits of game data that you can get. If there's any existing stuff regarding speedrunning, RTA being real-time attack, that's just kind of a short form that a lot of people use for speedruns in single segment real time rather than like a segmented run. There's all kinds of resources, some of which don't even really get updated anymore. But yeah. And then trial and error is probably going to be the vast majority of what people who route games are going to be doing. They're going to be trying everything that they can to see what ends up working and what ends up working fastest. But yeah, that's just kind of ends up being where we really get started. To kind of get a little bit into game data background research, the best place to start would be any sort of official guides that you can find, like any of those old Prima or Brady Games strategy guides. As I note in the bottom, take any of these with a grain of salt because they are prone to error. Even guidebooks are not immune to this. You'll see. I'll show you in a minute why exactly a website like GameFAQs can be really useful. Official strategy guides, game wikis, those end up kind of being the resource that a lot of people use, especially for indie games. There's all kinds of information you can get, especially if you're going to route like a roguelike or if you're going to try and do some sort of stuff for a game that's generally like harder to route. You still end up getting information out of this. These are just really good things to consult for speedruns in general.
Those kind of things are really important too for RPGs in particular, just because numbers are so important. Just kind of with the experience in Pokemon, there's a lot of doing damage calculations. So there's a lot of, going to Cerebi and Bulbapedia and things like that for numbers and, running numbers on almost everything you can.
Yeah, and to emphasize the whole things are prone to error, a good example of that is in Nier Automata for a long time in the beginning when they were trying to figure out the appropriate damage numbers. It was realized that the dash attack for the greatsword for some reason did ×4 damage when it was supposed to just do normal, I think like 1.5 or something. So even sometimes the game stuff isn't documented correctly. So it's
Yeah, really
always
just
good
never
to
assume
double check.
anything.
Yeah, that is a good bit of advice. Just never truly assume anything for too long. So I want to give actually a great example. It's one of the more infamous ones of why it's really useful to consult old forums, especially if you're getting started, especially if it is an older game. Whoops, I double tapped it. So this is a forum post from 11 years ago on the Persona 3 GameFAQs page, where somebody found out that there is a way to actually completely skip the final boss, and thus hours of what is ultimately a 26-hour game.
Yeah.
This guy found out a strat to just completely skip the entire end game, and nobody knew about this for a long time in the RTA community.
And the funny thing on top of all this, so I actually was one of the original routers for this, along with Nevitz, and yeah, we actually use GameFAQ forums for a lot of our routing because a lot of people actually put a lot of time to put in like the persona stats when you're making them, like what possible skills they could get. And we were going through all this, and we didn't even know this existed. And to the point that this also ended up applying to the portable game as well. So it was around for Fez, I believe it saved around like 5 hours or something. And then the portable, it saves 2 hours. And it was something that was always there. We just never spent the extra time going through and looking for it.
Yeah,
And that, I mean, it was a major time save and a major setup for the whole run just to get set up for the final boss, which takes 2 hours.
yeah, and it kind of this isn't a glitch, by the way. This is just straight up something that uses intended game mechanics in a way nobody really thinks to. And that, like, it should almost seem obvious, because what it is you talk to an NPC 3 times on 3 different days of the game, because the game follows a calendar system, and then on that third one, you talk to them on the final day, which you're not supposed to be able to do for any of the, like, in-game social links. You're not supposed, like, after those have started, you're not supposed to actually be able to do that on this day, but because you haven't actually started this one, anyone playing the game casually would think, oh, I would have started this one in, like, the first or second month of the game. So it ends up being a pretty big skip that just kind of went overlooked and then suddenly was found in an old GameFAQs post. So for RTA research, there are a few places that I would personally recommend getting started. YouTube, a lot of times you might find people who post like boss strats on YouTube. Like one of the series that I'm heavily involved in is the East series. There's a few guys who have uploaded like their fastest boss times. That's a great place to get started if you see anyone who's posted little segments of the run to kind of extract information and strats that you can from those sections. Although sometimes, like in the East games I mentioned, sometimes they use boss rush mode, which doesn't exactly have the same equipment, but can still give you a useful combat strategy. Say you see, oh, the best thing to do for this particular phase of the fight is to stand backwards, or to try and use a downward stab attack on a certain enemy attack, for instance. TAS videos. So TAS stands for Tool Assisted Speedrun, and sometimes you'll find tool assisted speedruns of various different sections of games or entire games that have not necessarily been routed in real time. And while a TAS is limited in how much you can extract from it sometimes because they can do things that no human can do, it still can be useful to employ TAS strats in your speedruns. So just getting any bits and pieces of information that you can to start, like, I can't emphasize enough that a big portion of speedrunning and routing in particular can just boil down to research.
Yeah, even a lot of the task videos, while there is the video there from what they do, they usually have some type of forum that has a lot of postings of them going actually into detail about certain things that happen. They can, even at that point, you can contact the actual person that made it, and they can give you, like, frame data for stuff.
There's a lot of tricks in speedruns too that are developed purely from them being possible only in TASs and someone just sitting down long enough to make it humanly possible. Palace Skip and Thousand Year Door is a really huge example. It was just thought not possible for the longest time, but we knew it was possible. And then eventually it was just worked towards just because people knew it was there and they had a goal, really.
Although I will point out that while palette skip was a very deliberate thing, a lot of the times things just end up happening by accident.
That's also true.
So
Yeah,
on the note,
a great one was in Slide 1, Lambo found a skip for auto section. He got so mad at it that he just spins his controller around furiously and he just popped out of bounds.
yeah. So to kind of answer the question that we had alluded to a little bit sooner, to just go on a little bit of a tangent here, how do people find these things? A good probably half to 60% of the time, by just a rough guess, it happens by accident. One of the games that I've run a lot is called East Memories of Salsetta, and one of the tricks that was actually found in the game is if you have like the game has a 3-party system, and you can swap characters in and out of your active party at any time. If you enter water, switch a character out from the lead position, get out of water, and then switch the character back, the character will fall through whatever solid ground that they're on, either causing them to fall all the way to the bottom, which the developers thankfully put a kill plane at the bottom in case anyone somehow managed to find a way out of bounds, just so you're not completely soft-locked. The thing with this trick is that on screens with water, you actually just rise back up, and the water extends all the way down to the kill plane. So when I found this by accident, I thought this was a complete fluke, and I didn't think that this was really useful for anything. It actually took a Japanese runner who saw me do this trick to think, where can I possibly use this? And found several different screens in the game where you can actually use this to get underneath certain walls or doors. And it ended up saving a lot of time, something like 15 minutes from the original Vita run. And then when we started employing it in more and more places, it ended up just breaking the game, being the first sequence break of a game that we originally thought was glitchless, which a lot of games that I have seen, we originally think that they're glitchless, and they're not. And I actually have a fun story to tell about this next part. So Speed Demo's Archive. Speed Demo's Archive isn't really used a whole lot anymore. It's a place to kind of check on things if you're looking to route a game. Sometimes there's old forum posts that you might find of somebody saying, hey, I thought about routing this old game, and ultimately never panned out. But this was actually a resource I used when I routed my first speed game, which was a game called Dragon Quest Heroes Rocket Slime, which was a DS top-down action game. Not a lot of people ran it because, unfortunately, handheld software is very hard to capture. But there's a lot of little bits of research that people had performed on there, and it was a really good place to start that ultimately was able to help me construct the first route of the game. And again, on a fun little note of that, that game was incredibly hard to find any glitches for until some guy, I was streaming the game once, some guy came into my chat and said, hey, I found this skip a long time ago, and it literally consists of just like dashing into a wall, which you wouldn't think would ever work. You dash into a wall, it zips you 2 screens upwards and saves about 1.5 minutes. So yeah, even some of the most like shatterproof games can end up having glitches. I think one classic example too would be Metroid Fusion, which was a game that a lot of people thought there's no way to like really break this game until somebody finally was able to find arbitrary code execution in the game that saves a lot of time on that run. And then finally, one actually really valuable resource, particularly for Japanese games, would be to go to a website like Nico Video. Nico Video is something along the lines of Twitch's Japanese Twitch and YouTube. Sorry. Admittedly, it is a little bit hard to use if you don't understand anything in Japanese, so I personally suggest a good place to start would be to look up videos with a game's Japanese name, and then RTA. So for example, here is Super Mario 64. Let's go back. Super Mario 64, and then just type in RTA. And you might be able to find something on the website there. I was able to find videos for games like Custom Robo, which is a game that I have run, and actually doesn't really need much routing at all, but we were still interested in looking up strats from Japanese runners. One little other thing to note on there is, unfortunately, a lot of videos on Nico Video are hard to access because there's a lot of paid subscription kind of content. I don't know, I can't stand their website, but sometimes it's the only resource available.
You can also kind of do the same trick on YouTube as well. A lot of Japanese runners will post their runs to YouTube and kind of use the same naming convention. Like for a lot of any percent runs in English, we'll title them like X any percent speedrun, whatever the game is. Whereas kind of the standard Japanese convention is just saying game name RTA.
Yes.
So you can get around that a little bit on YouTube as well.
Yeah, and thankfully a lot of the Japanese community, I don't know if like they just want more interaction out there, or YouTube and Twitch have really grown over there, or if they just really hate Nico video like some of us. Thankfully, more and more of them have been posting their stuff to YouTube. So YouTube's just a good place to go in general for background research, for RTA research and all that. And then finally, and this is going to ultimately be a lot of what this boils down to, is a lot of trial and error, a lot of crunching the numbers, a lot of trying everything that you can think of. And sometimes I do, and yes, I do mean everything. Sometimes that does mean something that ends up sounding like it's absurdly stupid might end up actually working. And if it's absurdly stupid and it doesn't work, well, then, you try the next absurdly stupid thing.
And sometimes it just takes the right person trying it too. Something that you thought, one person tried, they didn't think was possible or feasible. Some other person will come along and find a way to make it feasible. So even if, you don't find something, if you have other people you're working along with, sometimes it just takes another set of eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, like, a good example of just trial and error is in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Torna. We recently found zombie jumping, and it's because in most of the Xenoblade games, there's a death command for inputs that you can put in. So if you get stuck or anything, you can go to a safe spot and easily not have to deal with it. Well, so a lot of Torna was coded based off of Xenoblade 2, but they added in some additional stuff, like the main one being they got rid of inns but put in these camps instead. Well, the camps you have to access normally through the open world, so somebody just kind of decided surely they wouldn't have left this kill command active during the campsite. So somebody went in to the camp, held the buttons down for 5 seconds, and then left the camp. And lo and behold, you can get your characters into a death state by just staying at camp and buffering in the kill command. And so with that, we were able to zombie hover and just jump up to the end of the game and get the fast travel flag for it.
That's kind of how a lot of discoveries too. We were talking about how stuff happens by accident. Sometimes all it takes is one thing being found by accident, and it just kind of snowballs into being applicable in the entire game, and just everything changes with one find.
Yeah. And not necessarily by accident too, is like he's saying, sometimes you'll just end up finding something that's like ridiculous, but it comes from like what if I tried this absurdly dumb thing that, you wouldn't think they would put in, but it ends up being the case that it actually works. Now we're talking a lot about individual strats here. A lot of routing ends up boiling down to strat hunting, but a fair amount of what ends up being routing isn't necessarily even just finding strats or just finding glitches and stuff. It ends up just being trying to see how you can play through something as quickly as possible. So just going through the motions, basic movement, and all that. A lot of routing just kind of ends up boiling down to figuring out, the little basics. Because a lot of times people see like the fancy strat or the fancy glitch, and those often will need to lead to little reroutes. Like if you Palace Skip, for instance, as he mentioned, one of the big famous skips in Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. The thing with that is it ends up sequence breaking a ton of the game, and so once you find a strat like that, you can't just implement that strategy immediately. What this will mean is you have to figure out, okay, what can I cut here and there that would make this skip worth it? What do I have to still get to kind of replace it, especially in an RPG like that where, sometimes your level might matter, and then now that you've skipped this portion of the game, you don't actually have the stats or the levels to necessarily do something later. I don't think that's a problem for that game in particular, but I am saying for a major skip in an RPG, sometimes you're going to find yourself in a situation where, okay, now I can't beat the final boss because I'm not strong enough, and a lot of routing ends up coming out to being trying to fix that particular problem.
Yeah, the way I like to think about it, and it's a pretty common approach, especially with RPGs, is kind of thinking of your win condition, more or less. Just thinking about, kind of where you need to get to near the end and what gets you there, and then kind of trimming back from there. So, again, with RPGs, it's a really good example. It's like, what items can you get that gets you to the end of the game reliably, and then, as you can trim down more and more and more with, within reason of, risk and stuff like that too. You just kind of want to trim down as much as possible.
Yeah, and then effectively the same would be for like, a Mega Man game when you're looking at routing it. You would look at your route options, and then from there you start minimizing hits you take. To look at where you could do damage boosting to get through certain sections. You take pretty much a kind of a playthrough mindset, and then just start subtracting and adding things as needed.
It ends up just being a lot of subtraction and adding, like Gedrith said. Mega Man in particular being, you have to figure out, okay, which of the robot masters are the fastest? Like, do I do this one with regular Buster? Because you have to start at least one robot master with the Buster, and then you kind of go from there in terms of figuring out the weaknesses. And then when you get to like the Wily stages where, you don't always heal your abilities, you have to kind of figure out, okay, I can use this one here and here, but I don't want, like, even though it might make this fight faster to use a third charge, I won't have enough for a later portion of the run. So that ends up just being something you always have to factor in. Like, is it worth it to use it here? Is it worth it to use it here? And then you kind of just time it out. And unfortunately, it ends up being a little bit of a guessing game sometimes. It's hard to know exactly when something is definitively faster or not unless you're actually tassing the game, which I will get into a little bit in a moment on tassing in particular. So what are here are some of the myths and misconceptions we have about routing. The first, which I see, is a lot of people think they have to have technical knowledge of the video game. Like, you need to know TAS tools, you need to learn how to find memory addresses, you need to be able to, like, know how to TAS a game, or you need to know how to dig into the game's coding or programming. You really don't necessarily have to do this. Sometimes, especially when you get into like really complicated games, sometimes this ends up being the route, but a lot of games end up just having a route of somebody, sitting down, trying a whole bunch of things, piecing together a route to complete the game, and then refining it over time. Like, that's something that really anybody can do.
Yeah, like that's actually how I did Torrent New Game Plus when I decided I wanted to commit some time to it. Is I just sat down, started up New Game Plus, and did a playthrough of it. Got like 2.5 hours, and then I just looked at the file and was like, okay, time to start trimming some stuff off. And started prepping other things, pretty much just learned from the run. And I think that's a really popular way for a lot of people, even just learning runs. It's just boot up the game and just do a playthrough of it. Yeah, it might take you 3 extra hours than what would it normally be for the run, but it's a learning process. That's the part of it.
Yeah, you really need to just accept that it's not going to be perfect from the get-go, really, at the end of the day.
Another one I mentioned I have on here, routing is not glitch hunting. A lot of people think these are kind of the same, and a lot of people kind of assume that routing is a very difficult task because they assume they have to do glitch hunting along the way. You really don't have to. You can play a run glitchless. And as another misconception, which isn't necessarily particularly tied to routing, just because a game doesn't have glitches or really fancy strats doesn't mean it's not necessarily a fun speed game. One of my personal favorite games to run is a game called Custom Robo. The game is extremely rigidly structured, has no glitches except for like very, very microscopic ones that don't really save much time. And only one area where you actually can sort of kind of cut down on the sequence and do as minimal stuff as possible. The game is incredibly rigidly structured. What makes the game a fun speed game to me personally is the fact that it really depends on good game knowledge, good reactions, and just being good at the video game to enjoy it. So while sometimes people think that a game is not a particularly good speed game because it doesn't have all these fancy strats, a good speed game is a speed game that you enjoy playing.
Pokemon's another really good example of that because it's generally a series that's run glitchless or near glitchless. And it really is just a puzzle to solve. A lot of times, kind of the way I work on Pokemon runs is this is the Pokemon I want to use or I know is probably going to get through the run the best. And then I'll just kind of like work on what makes that work. And with Pokemon, it's pretty rigid as far as you have what moves you have access to, what trainers you're going to be fighting, what a little bit kind of going against knowing the background information, but what stats trainers are going to have. So you can basically just plug all these numbers in and just, very precisely calculate everything. Pokemon's just a lot of math, not necessarily really any glitch hunting at all.
Routers need to know everything about the game. It helps.
Yeah, and,
But-
and at the end of the day, not even somebody highly skilled is not going to know everything. Like DSS, everybody knows Dark Spine Sonics. He's probably one of the most well-known Sonic runners. I mean, he doesn't know everything about 06. He's put a lot of time into it, but
Yeah,
it's there.
he's very well known for knowing a lot about a lot of different 3D Sonic games, to the point where it's pretty often that somebody might say something like, "Oh, I found this," and then all of a sudden he's like, "Oh yeah, I remember that." It ends up being useless. You'll find people like that in the speedrun community a lot, who are very proficient in certain games, but even they don't always know everything. So if you just approach routing a game as a beginner, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to know everything about your game to be able to figure out a way to complete it. For the most part. There are occasionally games where you will run into something that's just like an absolute brick wall and you need some sort of insane thing to be able to reliably complete a run. But you don't know that until you've actually tried. So another one, I need to be a speedrunner to route a game. Some people actually don't run the games that they route. Sometimes they just are content to work on routing a game and then tell other people what they've found and then have them run the game.
I think we've all helped route something that we never touched. Like I don't speedrun Persona games. I've got 16 hours of my life to give away. I never learned Xenoblade Chronicles 2. I just helped Bowie with the initial route that came out. Like I enjoy doing it. I don't always have the time though.
Yeah, Pokemon Sword and Shield was another really good example for me. Kind of a lot of the more well-known runners like Kizaron, Etiquette, etc. Have been developing kind of what's been narrowed down to a Sobble-only route for Sword. And we're kind of at a point where Arcanine Excadrill for Shield is optimal. But Mamgar, who is another friend of mine, had the idea to route Shiftry in the early game of Sword. And that kind of gave me the idea, too, of, hey, Shiftry is Sword exclusive, so what's the Shield exclusive version, which is Ludicolo. So I worked on a Ludicolo route, and neither of those routes ended up being faster, but they're routes that we have, they're fun, and it's kind of just an extra option of something to do as well, so.
Another thing, it needs to be perfect before I start doing runs. This is a big misconception I've seen from some people, that they think, oh, they'll do a route and then they'll say, oh, is this optimized yet? First of all, speed routes will almost never be optimized. There will always be something that you can find eventually that will make it faster. So asking about optimized routes, it will probably, unless it's something like Barney's Hide and Seek for the Genesis, it will probably never be optimal. And even that they thought was optimal for the longest time until somebody broke it down and found out there are certain ways to make the game a little bit faster. So
This is kind of something interesting I find, too, this is slightly different than this point, but something I see a lot with newer games, like a game that came out, a week or two ago, is people kind of coming into Discords and thinking that there is a finalized route already, and they kind of just want something to learn and just be done with it. And that's kind of something that people just, I think, need to realize, is that routes will be changing all the time, and you don't necessarily have to keep up with everything. There is kind of an acceptable way to just learn a game at a functional level and then kind of keep up with everyone else doing their own changes, or kind of come up with things on your own.
And then finally, one thing I do want to add is the game has an existing route. Isn't that enough? A lot of the times, yes. Depending on how far along the game has come, there isn't a whole lot of need, especially for somebody to come in and try to reroute the game from scratch. But this is not always the case. Sometimes it can help to completely reroute the game. In fact, one game I actually touched, there's a RPG that I ran, really obscure, really goofy RPG called Cthulhu Saves the World. This game, there was 2 runners who had a route going for a long time. This was back early on when I had started speedrunning. I see this game and I figured I'd give it a try. The route was relatively optimal for what they were going for, in terms, it had been fairly optimized. And then a friend of mine by the name of Garrick came in and did it as a 12-hour challenge game, and he approached that game with the way he approached a lot of other routes. And the problem was, at the time, I was fairly new to speedrunning, and I thought, okay, this route's probably good because other people have already made it. Garrick routed in equipment to an RPG, which you would think in most RPGs, okay, I get better swords so that it does more damage. The old route ended up being really hard, being very suboptimal, and Garrick, after he did like all of his routing for the 12-hour challenge, ended up beating record by like 5 or 6 minutes on a very suboptimal run. So yeah, just because a route exists so far does not mean that it is optimal, and it does not mean that you can't implement something into it to make it faster. And like Oro said, with the Shiftery and Ludicolo routes, sometimes you'll end up routing something that doesn't end up being fastest. And that's okay, because at least the work was put in to try something different.
Yeah, and a thing to point out, I mean, it's modern gaming now. If you play a more modern game, patches happen. Stuff gets added, removed, changed. Everything it can change in the heartbeat. I mean, and Oros here is a prime example with Code Vein. I mean, within 2 weeks, it went from, what, a 2-hour run to now, like, a few minutes?
Yeah, that game that's another actually really good example of you don't need to run the game to find things or to route the game. We had almost an entire subset of people that was bigger than the number of people running the game that were just constantly looking for things and coming up with new ideas. And, you really just don't have to necessarily be running the game to find things for it.
Mm-hmm. And one other thing to kind of add, too, is I won't pretend like I'm an expert on this. This is just kind of what I've seen with it. And sometimes finding old stuff that might not necessarily be useful now might be useful later. What ended up happening with Super Mario Odyssey, for instance, was for the longest time, they were running the game on the physical release first patch of the game up until it kind of came to a point where the digital version ended up saving enough time through loads to make up for the time lost. So strats that would have been that weren't necessarily usable on the physical 1.0 release would now end up being useful in the digital release. Just as a theoretical example there of, if you found something a long time ago that might not necessarily have been useful then, but would be useful now. So here are just some general do's and don'ts that we have when it comes to routing games. For a couple of the do's, be patient. Routing is a lot of banging your head against something and hoping that it will work. And sometimes it will work. A few times, you never want to settle for something to just assume, okay, this worked once for me, it's going to work every time. That's not always the case. For example, in RPGs, if you route out a boss strat, and you're like, oh, okay, this worked for me 100% of the time. Well, maybe the boss didn't do all of their attacks, so you didn't see, how this would play out in the variety of different scenarios. And sometimes it won't end up working that often, and you got lucky the first time. So it ends up just being a matter of being patient, trying things out, and sometimes you're going to have to go through fairly dull portions of a run over and over to piece together, the good parts.
This is a huge thing with Pokemon, too, because even a lot of Pokemon is kind of like boosting your stats and then kind of one-shotting everything on the other team. But especially those first couple turns, there's a lot of, if they do this, I need to do this. If I do this, I need to do this. You have to kind of factor for every situation that you think or know is possible.
Yeah, like for a good example for me, Torna. So a good chunk of Torna is fetch quests, effectively. You have to get your community level up so high, so you have to do so many quests. And so for both New Game and New Game Plus, we had to figure out the right quests to do for everything. And, I mean, it's not entertaining things to show at all, but it's a very important thing to do. But another one is there's a specific part in the game in which you pretty much have like a mini-boss rush. And for originally in New Game, it was very difficult. You pretty much had I think it was like a 2 in 10 chance of actually beating the mini-boss, getting to the next one. A friend of mine, and I think he was the world record holder, but he ran that RPG limit break, Vax had. He set that down, I think it was like over the course of 2 days, he ironed out a strat that we ended up also being, we could subtract a level from what we were going in on that was 100% consistent. And it's just put in the time and you will find something eventually.
Mm-hmm. This is important. You want to time things. There's no point in just doing guesswork saying, oh, this is going to be faster than this. There's a lot of times I think people get caught up in thinking that something ends up being faster. You want to time things, and not necessarily, one thing that actually really does help too is make sure you're recording things that you can actually time them in such a way that you can count frame by frame of what you're doing. because unfortunately there's always a little bit of user error. Like one thing I had wondered for the longest time with one of the games that I run was, are these load screens faster on one platform or another? And I had to like actually go into, I ended up using a YouTube video for one, and going into like a video recording software and timing it, and it ended up having no significant difference. But you want to time it, and you also want to make sure that you're accurately timing it. Again, with East Salsetta that I had mentioned earlier, there's certain, for a long time we had wondered whether or not a certain character moves faster than another. And the way this ended up being tested was we had somebody record all 6 different playable characters going across a straight course with a turbo controller so that they can, account for inputs per second, and then just running this straight line and then timing it, and then using a video software to make sure that all of them start at the exact same time and that the timing ends exactly correctly. So it does help to like make sure that you're timing things rigidly. Sometimes you might not necessarily have that or even really want to, and you'll just try something and you'll see, okay, clearly, like even with user error, one thing is clearly faster than another. But it does just help to make sure that you time everything that you are testing, especially when you're comparing 2 different things.
Yeah, something that's really important as well. This especially comes up in RPGs and kind of the Mega Man example that we gave earlier. But if you're changing anything in the route that would affect something else, if it involves picking up an extra item or what have you, it's important to time every aspect of what that strat entails. With the Mega Man example, like, in some of the older games where you have to pull up the pause menu and switch weapons and things like that, like if you have a strat that saves 3 seconds, but you say the menu takes 3 seconds to pull up, you're just breaking even. You could just not do that entirely. There's other better examples of that, but it's kind of just a decent way of thinking about, you need to think about everything that is affected by what you're doing.
Yeah, like 2 things. Especially if you're doing RPGs, time your menus. Like that's actually really important. You can save a lot of problems down the road of, having all your menus timed out and looking at them later and being like, I can add this one into this one. Or, it'll take a few extra seconds, but I can do this menu here. It's actually really important to have all that already written down.
Yeah,
and
trying to like overlap as many menus as you can, cutting down on inputs. Like, if checking even if the menus wrap from top to bottom, like if you can, if it's 5 inputs to reach the bottom and you're, scrolling 5 inputs down to get there, or you can just go 1 from top to bottom, like that's really easy stuff for a lot of people to miss, and it's actually really important.
Yeah.
And then another one is don't always think that having bonus movement speed is great. So I was actually looking at this earlier today, and the Oro was sitting next to me. So I was looking at Zombie Hover and Torna, and I was adding it into New Game Plus. And in New Game, they do a lot of extra stuff with it, so it makes sense that they go out of their way, do some extra zombie hovers. And I was sitting there looking at it, I was like, well, the only one I need is to get to the end of the game, and it's a very long, maybe like 3 to 4 minute zombie hover. So I was like, maybe if I just run through the interior, the very end area, and just zombie hover around the doors that are blocking my way, maybe that would be fine and faster. Nope, not at all. Actually, it was like going to lose me 7 minutes. So, yeah, timing is very important.
And kind of what I was saying, not every router has to be a speedrunner of the game, but it does pay off significantly if at least the routers can execute the kinds of stuff at about the same level as a runner. Like, if you're routing something, make sure your menu speed, like he said, is, proficient enough that you can reliably, compare how fast something is for you compared to how fast it would be for a top-level runner for something. So it does still help to practice certain things if you're really interested in routing out a game. Gedrith, I'm going to let you talk about this one, but this is incredibly important. This might be the single most important thing to take away from this if you're at all interested in routing a game yourself.
Yeah.
Document everything.
And I mean everything. Everything is really important because, as I mentioned way earlier at the beginning, even the game is wrong sometimes. So you want the comparison there, but you need to know, like, when you're out in this game and you're going to spend, enough time in it, you want to know as much as you possibly can. So anything you find, even if it's just, like, a weird little soft lock, just go on and document it. You know it's there. Like back when I was looking at Xenoblade Chronicles X with a bunch of the Xeno runners, I found a soft lock by as you walk into a cutscene, I collected a collectible and it soft locked me. And nothing happened. I just stood there for the rest of it because it couldn't load the cutscene for some reason because it was trying to put something in my inventory.
Yeah, one
Nothing
example.
comes of it, but it's important to know.
Yeah, one example I actually do want to point out. So there's a game that I've recently worked on a route. It's not currently the used route for the game, but the game's been being shattered anyway, so even existing routes aren't necessarily very structured. It's a game called Bug Fables. It's a Paper Mario clone RPG. Clone might be a little bit of a might be a little bit too negative. It's a very affectionate spiritual successor to it. There is a skip in the game that can be accessed just after the second chapter of the game's 7 chapters. If you access this skip back when we found it, it just soft locks the game because you have not triggered the flag that lets you actually proceed through this next area. But this area is accessible as early as the 2nd chapter, even though you don't go there until the 6th. So we thought this was useless at the time. Lo and behold, a couple weeks later, we found various other skips, and some people who have put in a lot of work to actually figure out how the game's flags work have found that you only have to do a certain flag to be able to actually proceed into this area. So we found out later that there's portions of Chapter 4 and 5 that you can completely skip that would allow us to be able to use this skip in such a way that would allow us to still beat the game. So that the skip wouldn't have been useful like as early as we can theoretically execute it, but it would still be useful later on in the run. And so this has changed the route a little bit. And while we're still working on some stuff for the route itself, the fact that something that at one point was thought to be useless may no longer be useless, it was important that we documented it in the first place.
Yeah, that comes into the trial and error just a ton. I mean, even if it just boils down to, hey, I tried this is what my result was, not even saying like, oh, I don't think it's useful or whatever, but, it just gives you a good backlog of what people have tried, what their results were, what they thought about it. Just gives someone else a better starting point to pick up on it in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and another thing to add, please make your documents open if you're not going to run the game anymore or route it. It's very useful to have this stuff and to go back and update. Like, I make public spreadsheets for the communities when I'm routing stuff that will just hold everything, including if I find soft locks. And when patches happen, if I'm still helping out at the time, I'll go back and check those soft locks, see if they got removed or not. Mm-hmm. It's very important to know like all the stuff at the time.
Mm-hmm. You don't need to and when I say everything,
well, like
I mean
I'll double check your documentation is what
yes.
I'm more to gain at.
Yes, and sometimes it doesn't have to be clean. Like you don't necessarily have to document like, okay, the jump like in this particular thing doesn't save any time. Like you don't necessarily have to document like every single little detail. But document anything if you even remotely think that this would be useful for something.
Oh, I mean, it doesn't have to be pristine looking. Like, I literally typed chicken scratch somehow. But it's there, and that's what matters at the end of the day.
Right.
And then find a way that works for you. The point I'm making with this one here specifically, a lot of people have their own different ways that they route games. And while I will say that there really is only one optimal way for most games to beat a game, finding your own unique little style for how you route a game is perfectly fine. Not everyone routes things the same way. Some people go into extremely meticulous testing. Some people just find something that works. And both of those are valid, especially if you're routing a game that hasn't been routed before. And it's fine if your route ends up not ultimately being optimal, but as long as you found something useful to it, it does end up, being useful to do so.
And sometimes different methods can go pretty hand in hand as well. Pokemon is a really good example of this, where a lot of runners will kind of just play through the game repeatedly more than I would, and just kind of like change things more on the fly without really doing too much math behind it. Whereas on my end, I'll very, very meticulously go through, run numbers on literally everything, even if it's, something I could really easily make an assumption about, just because I want to know for sure what's going to work and what isn't. One really good example of this with Let's Go was on one of the very early routes. Kabutops was used in the later parts of the game, and we actually delayed Erica's gym, which is the grass gym. So it'd be really dangerous for Kabutops if we weren't super over leveled. A lot of runners who were doing kind of the first approach of just kind of trying things and changing things on the fly, everyone that had done it so far had just gone through that fight perfectly fine, not had any issues. But when I went through kind of my more meticulous style and got to that fight, I realized that they had basically been living something that was like a super low percentage chance of working, and they just had lucked out again and again and again. And it's just one of those things where, different methods of approaching things can help each other out and kind of bring light to things that they might not have never known.
And then that was what led to the leech life strat, right?
Yes, and then Kabutops ended up not even being used at the end of the day.
But yeah, for a time, this was how people were running the game.
Yeah.
Lost my train of thought there for a second. kind of along the lines. Oh yeah, I know where I'm going with this. Again, like one thing I personally will do is if I see a game that's currently being routed, I don't get stuck on whatever existing routes are coming out or already do. I sometimes, with games that I run, will deliberately route the game from scratch and keep myself away from, existing information, because what that can end up doing is if I follow other people's assumptions, I could end up missing something really important. So I will sometimes just route a game from scratch that somebody else already has routed, and thus I put my own ideas into it. And while maybe, only one or two of those will actually end up being something that gets put into the route, that's still important because that means that I found something that I would not have found if I had followed preconceived notions of other runners.
Yeah, it's one of those things. At the end of the day, routing isn't just, well, normally starts solitary. It ends up being a more collaborative thing because like I haven't touched Xenoblade Chronicles 2 in maybe a year. There's still stuff that I found like at the very beginning that's still being used. But at the same time, like the core route that Bowie, Aeon, and I all made does not exist anymore, really. So it's just one of those things you have to think of. Like, you're doing something now, it might not always be there, and sometimes there's going to be other people that touch your game at some point, and they're gonna add their own stuff, and it'll usually be more beneficial at that point.
Mm-hmm. So some of the don'ts. You don't bottleneck yourself into a solution. What that means is you don't say, like, I found one thing that works, this is what we should be doing. There's oftentimes several different things that work, and you want to try those out and make sure that you get something that ends up being the fastest.
Yeah, a big thing for this is one of the games I run, Mega Man ZX Advent, for the longest time. The game was pretty much set. And then finally we started looking at it, it's like, maybe if we like mess with the order a little bit of how we do things, maybe it'll change up stuff a little bit. And it ended up being like, if very small situations were made at the beginning of the game, depending on your health, it was optimal to do one area earlier than another. And so it's important just to look at things when it pops up and not just, we've been doing this for X number of years. This is the only way that we can do it now. It's been proven. It's like, but has it?
This kind of feeds into another like small side fallacy as well of just thinking that if you're going out of your way for something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not better. Code Vein is a really huge example of this. One of the early strats we were doing was a weapon buff that basically sacrifices your health over time in order to do extra damage, and it's an absurd damage multiplier. But I was basically the only one like really putting it into action and trying how it would play out. And it's more or less a thing that's like, yes, you can do it, but it's borderline impossible just to execute it, and you have to use a lot of resources just to maintain it. So I proposed, hey, let's go get this other thing that takes about 4 minutes to get, but it's a lot easier to maintain, it lasts a lot longer, and it's the same benefit as the other thing. And at the end of the day, that's what we do now, even multiple months after that change was made. So even if something is a really significant detour, that doesn't always mean that it's worse.
Yeah, I don't know the exact timing on it, but I believe there's something like that in the route for speedruns of Chrono Cross, where you take a fairly lengthy detour in order to get a really strong weapon that doesn't really quite pay off for quite a while, but the time that it saves adds up so much over time that it is ultimately worth it to do this fairly lengthy side quest just to get this one weapon, I believe. This is one of the unfortunate parts about routing. You don't want to get too attached to certain parts of the game. Everyone has their own favorite sections of a game. Sometimes you'll end up finding something that skips that. Maybe you want to route a new category that'll have that in, but sometimes like you just don't ever get too attached to a certain portion of the run because you might end up skipping it. One of my favorites, I ran East Memories of Salsetta. There's an item in the game that lets you run really, really fast. Turns out we found a few ways to route around this, and actually skipping this saves about 4 minutes. But we were all really bummed because it's like now one of the coolest things in the game is no longer there. It's still a really good run in my opinion, but things will change and sometimes you'll end up taking away certain stuff that maybe you really wanted to be there, but it is ultimately a faster speed game and sometimes even a healthier speed game.
Something else to consider with that as well is don't get attached to the difficulty of the run. A lot of games start off really difficult or really easy, and things that get found will change that in potentially either direction. So don't get too cozy with, oh, this speedrun is pretty easy, I don't have to worry about too much. Don't be afraid to make it more difficult if you need to, and just be ready for that possibility to happen eventually.
And don't get too attached to certain parts of your route. Things will change a lot when it comes to routing. There will be parts of the route that you're really proud of, parts of the route that you find really fun, and unfortunately, sometimes something new skips that entire stuff or makes a route obsolete. This is a fairly normal part of the routing process. It might kind of stink to, have your contributions no longer be relevant, but that doesn't mean that they weren't important.
Yeah, like going back to Torna, because I apparently am going to use that for all my examples.
It's a long and busy RPG. It makes sense.
It took a lot of time into, but Vax put all that time into that strap for the mini boss rush. Not even a big deal anymore now, since we can just go get better weapons with zombie hover. So it just made everything he put his time into obsolete at this point. But at the same time, now the route's a lot safer, so it pays off at the end.
Everything's a stepping stone, basically.
All right, so this final point, I put this here. It's a little bit tangential. This is more of a peeve of routers than it is an actual suggestion for routing. Please don't be that guy or girl or whatever you identify. Please don't be that person who goes into a Discord incessantly asking for routes. As we've mentioned, they're not always optimized. They're not always documented in a way that's particularly accessible. Like, I personally, whenever I write notes for my own things, I write them out in like very short sentences, like go to blank, or like I don't necessarily say, one screen north, one screen west, one screen north, one screen east again, etc. I don't have to document like those specific things. That might not necessarily be the easiest thing to read because a lot of it I've committed to memory, but like, just be willing to work with people who are routing games.
And in a lot of cases, to be ready to not just have a document to look at, and like be willing to like look at top runs, do research yourself, as we kind of touched on quite thoroughly earlier. Just be ready to not exactly have perfect resources in front of you when you're getting into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like a good example is a friend of mine, Chin. He runs Tales of Berseria. His notes is a 20-page long text document that is summed up in 4-line chunks going all the way down. Not great for trying to learn the run off of, and right now that's the only source of doing it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's there.
Yeah. All right, so we'll open it. If anyone has any questions, there's the microphone over there. If you want to ask us about any of our own experiences, if you want to ask for any tips, or just, if you want to say, hi, how you doing? Go ahead and step up. I'm doing all right. I think a lot of us are already a little bit tired at this point.
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
Oh, here we go.
I wanted to ask, hi, how you doing?
I'm doing
Hi,
good, Jello.
Yeah, thanks, Jello.
I don't have any other questions.
Okay,
thought of.
thanks.
I'll think of one.
Thanks for your time.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
So how do you guys approach a extremely new, just came out speed game as opposed to, a game that's a couple years old? What are like the differences in mindset going into that?
So we can start with Ghost Kumon.
I'll pass it to you, Oro, because I
Okay.
think you were the most involved in recent games. I've only routed like 2.
Okay.
And they were usually old stuff that I've filed for any speed game.
So I guess Code Vein is probably the most recent example, since I literally was working on the game from like day 2 or 3. I basically I didn't super crazy rush through the game. I usually take my first playthrough pretty thoroughly. That's actually something I would recommend too, is don't rush too quickly into running a new game. Don't try to go for day 1 world record or whatever. Take your time with your first playthrough, do as much as you can, find as much, all the items in the game or whatever, do as much completion as you can. And if you know it's a game that you're even potentially going to be interested in, again, document everything, take notes on everything, because especially in the early days, those resources are not going to be there. Wikis aren't going to be fully complete or, have anything on them at all. With Code Vein, something really important was just timing various weapon buffs that you had, getting down exact numbers, just kind of setting the template for yourself, making maps of where everything is. It's a lot more legwork, but it also is a little bit less stressful because there's no one else's pressure of, modifying an existing route or anything like that. You basically just have, the world is your oyster. You have everything to work with, and you can kind of set your own pace and just find things, however you see fit. So
Yeah, as Zora was alluding to, there are a lot of people who kind of, now that speedrunning has caught on as a somewhat mainstream hobby, still niche, but it has enough mainstream appeal that there's a lot of people who just kind of hop into a new game. It's like, I want to run this right away, and they will try and they will route something just like sloppy, something that kind of maybe gets the job done, and then they'll say something like, why doesn't this work, or why is this so inconsistent? They didn't take the time to plan it out. They didn't take the time to test things. Like, that is still as important for a new game. Like, there was a game that we came out not too long ago that I saw a tweet saying, like, I think I finally have a good route, like 3 days after the game came out. It's like, it's good enough to get the game finished, but this is not going to be what the route ultimately ends up being. So it would have, paid off a little bit more to have put in a little bit more time into it.
yeah, and even just something simple is just don't. I mean, it depends on your approach, as we touched on earlier, but don't get too quick to just do runs and grind runs. Just do, even limit yourself to, a run a week. Just say, hey, I'm going to do 1 run just to kind of have a checkpoint of my progress, and then spend the rest of that week kind of trying more things outside of a run scenario, and just try more things, time more things, and then, the next week do another run and see, where you are at that point.
I will follow up on that to say, though, that one misconception with a lot of games is like, oh, you need to spend a lot of time in the day, to be able to run certain games. You don't always, just as you don't necessarily have to spend a lot of time to be a speedrunner, you don't have to spend a lot of time to route stuff. Maybe you only have an hour a day to route a game, and that's perfectly fine and valid. It would be preferable if you had a little bit more time, but one of the beauties of routing is that unlike doing a full run, you don't necessarily have to do it all at once. You can do it bit by bit and stop and go as you please.
Sometimes even chipping away at it can be more productive, because some of my better ideas have just been from putting the game down and either just idly thinking about it, or just running ideas by other people, even if they haven't even messed with routing the game themselves, even if they're just, especially with new games, if it's a game just someone else has played casually that just talk to them about the game, and they might even just say something that sparks something.
You have anything you wanted to add to that, Gedrith?
Yeah. I mean, it's more important. It's really important. You don't have to have all day to do routing. I just like everybody else here. We have full-time jobs. We have lives. We have school. I mean, I come home from working 9 to 10 hour days, and I just open up the game and just play it. And if I find something, I put it in a spreadsheet. That's what I do for new games, especially.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi.
Hi, I have an actual question.
Okay.
Okay.
Go for it.
I'm sorry, that was a good question, man. I'm usually just the one who asks the bad questions. So I'd like to ask about routes that are already highly optimized. Like, let's say Super Mario 64 or Sunshine. Now, those have already had a bunch of work into it to the point where, say, in trying to optimize a game like that, people go for glitch hunting instead. And I know you guys said glitch hunting and routing are not exactly the same thing, even though they're related. But do you have any, say, tips on if there's, even in a game that's highly optimized, anything else you can still do? Or, you know, any tips for even just glitch hunting there? Like,
As somebody that actually really likes the glitch hunt, I would love to start with this one. So even in the most optimized games, there's usually always something. A great example for 64 was the longest time, God, way long time ago, was trying to figure out a better setup for clipping into the side of the pillar to get the star inside of it. And, you know, now it's the convoluted mess that it is, but it's extremely consistent. There's always stuff like that that's there. And the best way of starting is usually just finding like talking to somebody or just or finding some documentation and then just testing stuff.
Yeah, Canonless is actually a really good example in SM64. It was something that was kind of just wung for the longest time. And, you know, even if it's not something that would make the run faster, if it's something that makes the run safer or more consistent without really losing any time, that's a huge benefit that you can add to the run, even if you just don't find anything or if it's just a slight improvement.
Yeah, I mean, it is a good reminder, like, Canonless is still faster by just running into the wall and praying, but the setup is 100% consistent. So that's
a
why
good
they do
line
it.
to draw with a lot of like real-time runs as well. Like, you know, a lot of segmented runs or TASs, people will go for whatever is fastest, regardless of consistency. But as far as real-time goes, a lot of times you don't necessarily even want the thing that's the fastest. You want the thing that's the most consistent, just to get you, like, make sure you're gonna finish runs, especially when you're new to anything. That's all things that you can add in later at your own discretion, but it's kind of just a matter of what you're comfortable going for.
Yeah, and kind of the basics on what you asked with like glitch hunting and stuff. A game like those, like, it's usually fairly hard to find a glitch if you're not really proficient in the game's mechanics, especially if you're not proficient with like the game's code, because that game has like fairly extensive tasking scene. But like even there, sometimes just trying out any idea you have and just bashing your head against the wall. And sometimes it takes a lot of work. Like in the case of Sunshine, the Gelato Beach skip was something that, you know, up until 2014, people figured, okay, if we grab this shine, we'll be able to skip a lot of time. The person who ended up finding that skip was basically trying everything he could think of for like a good 3 days before he finally came up with something that could reasonably be done in real time to skip that. And that ended up changing that entire game. So maybe you don't necessarily have that amount of time, but just an idea, a lot of patience, those two things can go, you know, a long way in trying to figure out how to, you know, how to find a strat. And then that will end up changing, you know, the entire run if all works out well.
Yeah, I mean, and you don't have to have, like, you know, extreme knowledge for, I mean, and you need the knowledge for at least how, like, some glitches work if you need access to those, but you don't need, like, tasking equipment or an emulator. For the longest time, Sonic 06, I mean, we had no way of actually digging into the code until we finally got an emulator a while back. But so we just kind of did stuff to test things. For the longest time, we thought in Silver Story we had to do the trials. And after a point, we finally figured out, oh, we can just hover up 3 different walls and be able to fly over. Oh, but everything's frame perfect, so nobody's going to reasonably do this ever. Yeah, thanks, TSS.
Yeah.
And now we have only 3 people that have reasonably done it ever.
Yeah, it's and you don't always have to know how something works. It helps to know how something works so that you can repeat it. But there are a lot of times that you'll have a skip, and you'll even see this in marathons. So yeah, we can just do this. We don't know why this happens or how this works. All we know is that you can do it. Sometimes that just ends up being the case. So, all right. Does anyone else have a question they want to ask?
Yeah, thanks. Go for it.
Go for it.
Well, not really a question because your focus is mostly in RPGs and like mine's on 2D platformers. With like several of the games I've run, they have in-game IL
Sure.
replay systems, and that could be like a really good resource for games like that.
Absolutely.
Like
Right, yeah.
even if something is not necessarily viable for full game runs, you can often find like a new setup for something else in them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Although,
Mega Man 11 is actually a really good example of something like that. It has, individual time attacks for each of the levels. It has individual time attacks for bosses, and that just helps a lot with just that trial and error and not necessarily, loading up the full stage and going through everything to get to the boss and retry things. But yeah, just
although it is important to know, like, a route isn't always, even for a 2D platformer where it mostly consists of, different sections. The sections are great to practice. Not always do they work in the full run to just repeatedly just apply every IL thing that you do. So, for one, some strats work best when you're practicing ILs that are only 2 minutes, but aren't necessarily great like if you're doing a 2-hour run because, they have such a ridiculously high, fail rate. Another thing is sometimes certain things only work in story mode that would not work in an IL, like Super Monkey Ball 2 is a good example. Sonic 3 is another example where, like, if you were to continually just apply the IL strats, you would completely miss that you can actually skip certain levels through, like, resetting the console and, like, Ice Cap, for instance. Or maybe I'm thinking of another level. Sorry. Sorry, it's been a while since I've watched
And
the
building
run.
on
It's
top of
definitely
that,
missed the
games
race.
like Sonic Colors, having different modes. The IL strats don't work in Egg Shuttle because Egg Shuttle, you can have boost carryover and you have access to different strats just from that existing by itself. He looked down. And actually, I think at least between me and Oro, we actually have some 2D platform experience.
yeah.
But yeah, like having the extra options. I think Freedom Planet, didn't they also incorporate a replay system like that as well?
They also ended up switching from with one category from classic mode, where it's usually just ILs.
Yeah.
Oh,
But
yeah.
they did that, and so after points, other runners would find things, and it would get back to Flatovy, who's like the god of Freedom Planet, and he's utterly broken the game because he's had access to things like that.
Yeah, and really kind of coming down to a 2D platformer, there is still elements of routing involved, but it mostly just comes down to trying out every single path that you can in order to, complete the levels. It ends up being a little bit more of like, rather than piecing together one big puzzle, it just kind of comes down to a lot of smaller puzzles.
Right, yeah. Thank you.
But thank you. Hello again, Jello.
All right. All right, this is kind of rhetorical, but I see it a lot. So there's a lot of people who are constantly fed up with like routes consistency and stuff like that. How would you recommend routing for someone who's constantly fed up with like a routes or consistency, like there's too much RNG or like the difficulty of the route?
Those are the best times to actually look at routing, even if it doesn't yield any positive results. Like there's a specific boss in Sonic 06 Shadow Story that I hate, and it's Egg Cerberus. You don't know how many hours I've spent into just trying to figure out if there's a way of like just manipulating it. You can't. I now know that 100% you can't. But it's good to. Those are the best times to do it. Like I brought it up a long time earlier. It was Lambo. Was trying just to do runs, got fed up with saying, accidentally found a glitch that broke everything. Being frustrated tends to be great inspiration for routing, or leads into routing in some situations.
Sometimes I unfortunately, sometimes the answer is deal with it.
Yeah.
Paper Mario 64 is a good example. The any percent category in that game is incredibly RNG heavy, and that just ends up being the optimal way to do it. And any other routing for that game, unless there's something that we haven't, I'm not a part of that community, unless there's something that hasn't been found in it, that currently is where any percent is. That might change down the line, but that sometimes the best way would be deal with it or find another speed game, unfortunately. Like just being 100% honest, but at least give it a try.
Thanks, Jello.
All right.
And it's not bad to put down a speed game for frustration, even in the routing phase. If you were just always angry at yourself when you're trying to route the game, it's good just to step away.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't even mean you have to permanently put it down either. Sometimes just a week away is all you need. So,
All right. So in conclusion, thank you very much for being here. It's been fun. I hope you learned maybe something, or at least thank you.
thanks.
And maybe not just like kind of take away something, or maybe just because a lot of this is kind of just fairly. It seems like it's fairly obvious information, but it helps to kind of keep it all in mind. So yeah, again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, GDQ, for having us.
Yes.